So first clear day, it's been snowing for like a week solid, which is a good thing because I've had the sleds out. But it also meant I had a lot of snow to clear. And that's okay, I actually kind of enjoy clearing snow. But the other day I came out and the ATV wouldn't start. So in today's video, I'm gonna go through everything you need to do if you press your starter and it just clicks or doesn't do anything at all. So a lot of the principles we go over today are going to apply whether it's a snowmobile, an ATV, or anything with an electric start. Okay, so this is a 2007 Honda Rancher that I use for plowing snow. So pretty typical when you have an older machine, you come out, you turn the key on, you press the starter, and all you get is... So what I'm going to do in today's video, we're going to go through the various steps that I would take to problem solve and repair this problem. So before we get started, grab your multimeter. And if you don't have a multimeter, then go out and get one. So if you don't know how to use a multimeter, no problem. I actually did a video on how to use one of these things. If you're going to have an old ATV or an old sled, unless you want to take this thing into the shop every time you've got an electrical problem, get a multimeter and learn how to use it. So starting a motor is simpler than you might think. Basically, you just turn in the crank over, right? So you're moving the pistons, sucking fuel in, turning your magneto, creating a spark, and starting that whole combustion cycle. So there's different ways to do it. If you think back in the old days, they used to turn that hand crank. It's exactly the same thing. So some of your machines, you've got a pull start, or you may have both pull start and electric start. So all your electric start really is doing that for you. So you've got a motor that turns, it's got a gear on the front, it turns your crankshaft and starts your motor. So your starter motor is going to be mounted down there to your motor, the battery is under the seat. You've got a switch on your handlebar. When you push that button, it's going to provide 12 volts to that starter. Now there's another part we're going to add into that circuit, and that's something called a solenoid. So from your handlebar, you've got little thin wires coming down. The starter has great big thick like 8 or 10 gauge wires. That's because the starter draws so many amps. So obviously we don't want those big heavy wires coming down our handlebar. That's why we use a solenoid. The solenoid is basically like a switch. So the way this works, when I press my starter button on the handlebar, it's going to provide 12 volts into the solenoid with this. That is going to drive a little contact up inside that's going to make contact with these two terminals. One of them is the battery side and the other is the starter. So if you watched my video on problem solving winches, that might sound familiar because your winch will have a solenoid as well for the same reason. So to start this job, we got to get the airbox out of the way because the starter is down there underneath the airbox. So we're going to take the air filter out, and then it's kind of hard to show you while I work, but down underneath here, there's just a couple of hose clamps and there's another one at the back. Once I disconnect those, I can get this airbox out of the way and give me room to work. So the first component we want to rule out is the battery. Do we have the 12 volts and the cranking amps to flip that solenoid and turn that starter? So you can use your multimeter to check the voltage on the battery. That's really not enough. I've got a little battery tester that'll tell me the cranking amps as well to give me a better idea of the overall health of that battery. I run my test. I have 12.8 volts and 379 cold cranking amps. So this battery is fine. So this is just a little cheapy battery tester. I bought this off Amazon. There's a ton of different types of testers and load testers that you can get. The main point is don't just rely on a simple voltage test. So now I want to rule out the starter button on the handlebar. So remember, the button on your handlebar provides 12 volts to the solenoid. So what you want to do, you want to unplug this, so these two thinner wires, and you want to test the socket that this plugs into. And you're testing the yellow and the red wire. So I'm going to set my multimeter for voltage, DC. I'm going to take my red probe, I'm going to put it on the yellow and red wire going to the ATV, and I'm going to put the black wire on the negative for the battery, and I'm going to press the button, and I should get 12 volts here. Okay, the next thing I want to do is test that solenoid itself. So on the ATV, it's right here. So what I'm going to do, again, I'm setting for continuity, and I'm going to put my leads on each side of that. Okay, because again, what happens when I press the starter, it should move a contact up and connect those two terminals. So I'm going to turn my key on, and I'm going to press this, and I have continuity. I can hear that beep. So I know my solenoid's good. Now the other thing your machine might have is some fuses in here to protect the circuit. So those are fairly straightforward to test. You could test them with continuity across each prong. Or you could just take them out and look at them. You can usually see if they're blown. All right, so I'm pretty much diagnosing a bad starter. So I've pretty much ruled out everything else. My battery is fine. It's got good voltage, plenty of cranking amps. My key works, my starter switch works, my solenoid is clicking, and I've got continuity across the terminals. The other test I did, I tapped on that starter with the starter button pressed, and it did kind of make a bit of noise before it died. It's not doing that now. So the other test I could do is stick my multimeter on that starter. I would put the red lead or the positive lead to the power wire that's connected to the starter, and then the black would just go to ground. And then if I've got 12 volts there when I press that starter, then I've confirmed it's my starter. So I was already 99% sure that I had a bad starter, but by putting the multimeter on there and double checking I got 12 volts when I hit the starter button, now I've ruled out any broken wires or bad connection between the solenoid and the starter. All right, so don't let starter problems intimidate you, because the bulk of the work is done. I've identified the problem. Now all I got to do is replace that starter, and that's like 3 bolts. Take the old one out, put a new one in. All right, good news. The starter that I ordered yesterday has already arrived. Thank you, Amazon. So we're going to pull that old starter out and get the new one in. So before I start, I remove the battery. You at least want to disconnect it. I like to get it right out of the way. So now anytime I'm disconnecting or reconnecting anything in this circuit, I don't have to worry about accidentally touching something that I shouldn't. And with the battery out of the way, it gives me a little bit more room to access the connections in the battery box. So with the air box out of the way, it really is a simple matter of undoing 3 10mm bolts. Okay, and there it is. So there's the old starter. So it was pretty easy to get out. It was really just held in with 2 bolts, but it is fairly tight. So I actually had to pry a little bit just to get it moving. But then, yeah, it just pulls straight out. And I'll see if I can give you a look in here. That's where it goes. And then if you really want to confirm that you were right, you can just throw 12 volts directly to that starter motor. And we can see that it's pooched. It's not doing anything. So that for sure was our problem. So whenever I order from Amazon, I just hold my breath that the part is exactly the same. And these two look pretty close. I think we'll be all right. All right, so I did film the next part, but it's really tight down there. My arm was in the way. But basically, your new starter will just slide right back in where the old one came from. At most, I had to do a little twisting just to get the teeth to line up, but it was totally simple. Then you're just going to put your bolts back in and put your wires back on. So when you bolt the new starter in, there is an O-ring on it. So you just want to make sure you don't mess that up when you slide it in. So you want to put a little bit of oil or grease on that, just something to add a bit of lubrication so it slides in easier. So there we go. There's our nice new starter installed. Now, I always hold my breath a little bit when I order an aftermarket part from Amazon, but so far it looks like that part fits no problem. So we're going to put it all back together and hope that it works. So this was the only part of this job was a bit of a challenge, was actually getting this air box in and out, because it's a pretty tight fit. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. I'm just going to cut the camera. There's no need for you to be subjected to that kind of language. All right, that's everything back together. All right, moment of truth. Have we fixed our problem? Yes, we have. I am a starter god. So I decided the best approach was to put a new fresh motor in there, and I feel good about that. But you can refurbish these as well. So I'm going to do that with this one eventually. So what happens is 2 brushes in there, and as the winding in the center spins, those brushes get worn down. Firstly, they don't make contact anymore, and secondly, this gets full of black like carbon dust. So you can take these things apart, you can clean them up, you can re-grease the bearing, you can put a new set of brushes in, and then I've got a decent spare sitting on the shelf. Now, there was one minor but really annoying challenge in replacing that, and it's easier to show you on the workbench, but it's this stud that the power connects to on the side of the starter. And you've got a ring terminal that's sandwiched between 2 10mm nuts. Now the problem is I couldn't fit a wrench between them to hold that bottom nut while I turned the top one off. So what I ended up doing, I just put a long screwdriver down in, just enough to hold that terminal from turning so that I could get a wrench on the top and turn that one off. So I did order a small flat adjustable that's perfect for this kind of job, and it came about an hour after I finished. All right, so if you've got an issue with your starter and you've never worked on one before, hopefully that demystifies it a little bit. Just work the problem in order from beginning to end. So start off, is your battery in decent shape and is it fully charged? Once we know our battery is okay, we want to rule out our switches. If you've got 12 volts back at your solenoid when you hit the starter, probably everything upstream of the solenoid is fine. After that, we want to rule out the solenoid. So grab your multimeter, set it for continuity, and check the big heavy terminals on the solenoid. So once you've ruled out everything else, it's time to admit the problem is probably with the starter itself. Now, you could also have corroded connections, broken wires. Those are pretty easy to check by testing for continuity. So not only did you just save yourself a ton of money, but at the end of the day, if you're honest, there's nothing quite as satisfying as turning the key and knowing you did this yourself. All right, guys, so that is it for another video. If you liked it, if you found it useful, or you just enjoyed hanging out with me, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. If you haven't already, take a second and subscribe to the channel. Click the little bell icon, you get notified when I post a new video. So until next time, I'm David Clark. Thanks for taking the time to watch. You know, the end of the there's nothing as satisfying as turning the key and hitting the starter and knowing that you did this. Oops. As turning the key, pressing the starter and knowing you did this yourself.